Good evening, friends, and good morning to all the people sitting in the States. I welcome all of you to our 10th webinar, and our topic today is the 2020 US presidential elections and the impact on Indo-US relations. Joining us today is Taniel S. Koushakjian. Please correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrongly. Okay? And Taniel is working as a director of public policy with Hindu American Foundation. Taniel has a lot of experience working in DC with the senators, with Congress members, and Taniel has been active in countering the influence of the Islamist organizations in the DC circles. And so today we have Taniel. He will enlighten us with what's going in the US. So now I'll just leave it to you, Daniel. You have to start that. So we have a set of questions which I already sent you. So I'll begin with what's so special about this election? What it's like. What is an average American feeling, especially after this COVID pandemic and after seeing the true colors of China?
This is an unprecedented election. We here in the United States have never been a part of an election this divisive in probably over 100 years. But adding an extra layer to all of that is the COVID-19 pandemic. You have concerns about Russian influence or foreign influence in the U.S. elections. It was documented and confirmed that Russia and others tried to interfere in the U.S. elections in 2016, and that they are doing so again this year. And then you have the COVID-19 pandemic, and then you have a very divisive presidency with President Donald Trump. You kind of love him or hate him. There really is no in between. It's pretty black and white amongst the electorate. And then you have on the other side, you have Joe Biden, who was a statesman who's been in government for over 40 years. It was a very long track record, and the people that he surrounded himself with. So this is going to be, they always say in American politics, every presidential election is the most consequential election of our lifetime. But this one seems to be that much more significant as far as the course of America is concerned. And I say that, and I'm going to try to answer your questions in my comments here, because you have a rising China. You have essentially the first president to really stand up to China when it comes to trade, when it comes to the theft of intellectual property, when it comes to manipulating currencies, and all of the things that China has done to elevate itself, not to mention the foreign debt entrapment policy of China vis-a-vis its periphery and countries around it, where it basically entraps through debt certain countries and their facilities and their properties, and has now taken control of seaports all around the world. And this is a deep concern to the United States. The United States policy towards India has been increasing as far as partnership is concerned, as far as maritime cooperation, national security and defense cooperation, terrorism cooperation, and extremism, but also economics and trade and good governance and things of that nature, which is very, very important. So right now, this is a very, very consequential election. But there are so many other factors on the minds of Americans. Is it safe for me to vote? Is it safe for me to vote by mail? Is the information I'm receiving on Facebook or online accurate? Some people are asking those questions. Some people are just believing what they read. But those are some of the layers that we're dealing with here in the United States. And then on top of that, you have concerns about voting by mail. And voting by mail has statistically been shown to be very safe, very reliable, very little fraud. It is easy to manipulate in certain aspects, but we've found very little fraud so far when it comes to mail voting. And on top of that, you have the postal system, the U.S. postal system, which is underfunded. and could probably use a lot more funding to make sure that our system is robust, because the mail ballots in the United States has practically doubled. People in the United States like to vote in person. We have early voting as well. So before Election Day, there's usually a week to 2 weeks of early voting where people can go to polling locations in their localities and vote before the election day if they want to vote in person, but they don't really trust mail. And now what you're seeing is because of COVID-19, what you had traditionally in the last presidential election, about 29% vote by mail turnout. In this election, you're going to have close to 70% vote by mail turnout. So the number of people voting by mail is going to double practically, if not more so, which means less people voting on election day. And Republicans tend to vote in person on election day, and the trends have been that most of the ballots that come by mail are Democrats. And so you'll probably see a large influx of Democratic ballots by mail in the beginning, and then Republicans sort of catch up, and then election day you'll have a higher majority of Republicans turn out during early voting in person and on election day than you will on as opposed to Democrats on election day or in person. So these are all the things that are changing, right? These are all the fluid aspects of American politics and American campaigns. It's not like Europe where you have 30 days to campaign. Here in America, you have a year or so or more to start your campaign. And so this is going to be the most important election. And there's so many factors that I just discussed that could impact the results, impact the turnout. You never know what can happen between now and election day. I remember in 2016, you had FBI Director James Comey put out statements regarding Hillary Clinton that were seen to either benefit or not benefit or disadvantage her just days before the election. I don't know if we're going to see something like that again this year, but it's quite possible. And the way Americans are feeling right now, I think that's reflected in the statistics when it comes to vote by mail. Americans right now are concerned that their mail ballot might not make it in time. And in certain states, it's not whether your ballot was postmarked by a certain date, it's whether it's received by the election day deadline and timeline. It's usually 7 o'clock on election day. So even if you're postmarked it and it's received after that, your ballot won't count. And so what you're seeing is more and more people actually dropping off their mail ballots, or they're going to vote in person. But again, with COVID-19, supervisor of elections are taking all the necessary precautions with hand sanitizers and social distancing. But you're going to see a lot more people vote by mail. You're already starting to see that. You see a president who is very divisive. And again, you either love him or you hate him. And then you contrast that with Joe Biden, a person who's been in government for 40 years. And you have what's going to be the most consequential election in our lifetime to determine the direction of the United States. And that impacts our friends and allies, our enemies, and U.S. reputation around the world.
Thank you, Taniel. It was really a very good overview and kind of an introduction, for all of us here. And so normally, of late, the Indians have started taking more interest in the U.S. elections. And I think you mentioned about the underfunded U.S. postal system. That reminds me of when I was in Ithaca. Whenever I used to visit them, they would always complain about the funds. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a common thing.
Yes.
What you talked about with I think you're what you're gearing at is the role of Indian Americans in this election.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think you can make the case very easily that the Indian American community, the Hindu American community, is more awake today politically than they ever have been. The Hindu American Foundation, where I work, is a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We don't endorse candidates. We don't oppose candidates. We're not. That's not what we do. We're legally not allowed to support or oppose a candidate for public office by law. That's what HAF is. We're an advocacy and education organization. But I can tell you from my conversations with Hindu Americans around the U.S., I can tell you from what I read online and what I see in my WhatsApp groups is a major shift from people who were traditionally Democratic voters that have embraced Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And there are a lot of factors as to why. Now, the numbers aren't such that, over 50% of Indian Americans support Donald Trump. It's not anywhere that close. It's about 30% support Trump and 70% will vote Democrat. Maybe 65-35 at this point. Traditionally, Indian Americans have voted 80-85% Democrat. So just that small swing of 15 points, 15% Republicans, Indian Americans to 30%, that doubling from 15% to 30% for Republicans for Donald Trump can have a huge, huge impact, especially in states with major Indian American populations like Florida, where you have over 100,000 Indian American voters, and other states, swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio. There's a big Indian and Hindu American community in Cleveland and in Akron. In fact, I was on the phone with a couple of folks out in Ohio earlier this week. And these numbers could swing the election. Donald Trump won Florida by less than a percentage point. Senator Rick Scott won Florida by 10,000 votes. That 15-point swing in the Indian American electorate away from Democrats and towards Republicans could be a major impact on the results. And if you combine that with a less enthusiastic Democratic electorate, because American elections are typically about a couple of things. One, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? That's the number one question that Americans ask themselves when they go into the voting booth. Am I better off today than I was 4 years ago? And I think a lot of Americans can make the case that they are, but there's also a significant amount of Americans who can make the case that they are not. And so that remains to be seen how that's going to shape out. Two is enthusiasm. You have to rally your base in American politics. As someone who's worked in campaigns and has been a candidate himself, you have to turn out your base. You have to rally your base. If your people don't show up, it's that much harder to win and get new voters. But you have to shore up your base. And right now, both parties are trying to shore up their base, but we see a little bit more enthusiasm on the Republican side than we see on the Democratic side. At least that's what I'm seeing. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the main theme of the Democrats that I'm seeing is we need to remove Trump, stop Trump, get Trump out of office. They're not really saying what they're for all the time. So in politics, you can't always just be against something. You have to be for something. You have to put your vision and your platform forward. And even though there is a very loud and vocal component of the Democratic Party and the left that is anti-Trump, there are less people that are talking about what they're for. And I think Joe Biden's trying to do that. He's trying to say what he's for, what his vision is. But it's being drowned out by those very loud voices who are just very anti-Trump. And you can be against something, but in American politics, Americans want hope. They want to feel that they're being talked to. They want to be inspired. They want to be led. They want to look up to their president as the father or the parent of the country, the mother of the country. And so when you juxtapose that with an electorate that may be yearning for that positivity, but all they're getting is negativity, that may not bode so well. Now, another factor that's really important is the Supreme Court. The fact that you have a Supreme Court vacancy with the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg this month, and now a rush to replace her on the court, that is going to be a huge enthusiasm boost for Republicans, a very big enthusiasm boost. In fact, you can make the case in 2016, when Trump was first elected, that the Supreme Court was on the line. And I remember talking to my wife about this in 2015, or early 2016. I said, the Supreme Court, there's a potential to be 2, maybe 3 vacancies in the Trump presidency. This is huge. This is huge. Having a president to nominate 2 or 3 Supreme Court justices, that hasn't happened before. And that's another layer of enthusiasm, right? And that goes to what I was talking about as far as what motivates Americans to come out to vote, is that enthusiasm. And a Supreme Court nomination is very, very much an enthusiastic or an enthusiasm boost for the Republican Party. How are the Democrats going to counter that? They're going to try to do it with COVID relief aid and it's another stimulus package, but those talks have stalled right now in Congress, and Congress is on recess until the election. So nothing is essentially getting done in Washington. It's all hands on deck for the election. And we're looking at a very high turnout election, record number vote by mail, unprecedented as far as there being a global pandemic that is ongoing at this time. You add a Supreme Court nomination to that fight, and you have a very, very interesting and uncertain election. But there are more than just the presidency, and I hope we have an opportunity to talk about more than just the presidency, because there are other races that are very important for Indian Americans and for U.S.-India relations.
Thank you so much, Taniel. So, I think, what you want to say is that Trump has very strong chances of winning the elections. Okay, but what about this whole handling of the COVID pandemic episode? Because in the Indian media, most of the, I would say, prominent mainstream national media houses, they are projecting that the Americans are really very upset with the way President Trump handled the COVID pandemic. First, this question, and the second one: if Trump wins, what happens to the Indo-US relations? How do you look at that? Besides that, the US policy towards China and the US policy towards Islamism in general.
Very good. Lots of good questions there. So with the president's handling of the COVID-19, the data that I've seen, the statistics of the surveys and the polls have him at very low approval numbers for handling of the pandemic. Now, amongst Republicans, it's a little bit higher than it is, or it's a lot higher amongst Republicans than it is among Democrats, but it's still well below 50% as far as handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that is going to be a major factor, because again, it's what, am I better off than I was 4 years ago? But now you have this, am I better off with this president in the middle of a pandemic? And that's a new question that you don't really get asked in an election year. And so that is going to be a significant factor as the president's handling of the pandemic. And you can see that illustrated in the attack ads from the Biden camp. The Democrats and the Biden campaign are hitting President Trump hard on COVID, on the number of deaths in the United States. They're trying to tie the president's Trump himself to the COVID pandemic in the United States. It's a smart strategy. I would recommend that strategy if I was their consultant, because that is a very sound strategy to employ. The question is, will it matter to Americans? Will Americans associate the pandemic with how the president has been handling it? And I think the messaging from the Democrats is going to be key here, because if they can get the message right on that point, it's a big opening and a vulnerability for Trump. But if they jumble that message, if they can't get the message right, and a lot of times you've seen that happen recently, is a problem in messaging from the Democratic camp, that will help Trump. Now, what was the other part of your question you were talking about after COVID? Oh yeah, U.S.-India relations under Trump. If Trump were to win, if what you've seen under this presidency in the last 4 years when it comes to U.S.-India relations is a significant increase in trade, military expenditures. There is an effort in Congress to give India non-NATO status, which is an increase, a higher level of partnership that only Israel and Saudi Arabia enjoy with the United States. So India is not on that non-NATO status strategic partnership level. And there's a bill in Congress, HR 2123, the U.S.-India Enhanced Cooperation Act, that is pending in Congress. Some of that language has been incorporated into the FY20 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. This year, the NDAA, even though it's must pass, was not passed, and they've punted that to December. So we may see some more strong pro-India language in this year's NDAA get passed, but it's not at that level yet. And I think that with a Trump presidency, I think regardless of a Trump or Biden presidency, I think India will achieve that status. But there are certain things impeding that. One, it was the decision of the Indian government to purchase the S-400 missile system from Russia. That was a big alarm bell or a red flag for members of Congress here in the U.S. And I remember that was last year because at the time, Turkey had also purchased the S-400 system from Russia. And the Congress was going to sanction Turkey or at least put in language in the NDAA that would be negative on Turkey. That would be negative towards Turkey purchasing the S-400. However, India did the same thing, right, at the same time. So you can't let India get away with doing something that you're hitting Turkey to do at the same time, right? That was the thinking. And so both Turkey and India received some scrutiny from Congress for purchasing that S-400 system. But I think India is a much different country and a far more global player than Turkey is when it comes to global geopolitics. That being said, there's definitely a lot of room for improvement in the U.S.-India relationship. A Trump administration would continue the policies that you've had today, a strong personal relationship between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump, great relations between Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Mr. Jaishankar. So you have the level of relationships from the top all the way down is very strong and very solid with this administration. Would a Biden administration be that much different? Well, I think a couple of things here. One, I don't think you will see a backtracking or a reduction or a step back from the U.S.-India, from the momentum that has been building and the deepening that has been building in the U.S.-India relationship. I don't think you're going to see that with the Biden administration. However, there are certain people that Vice President Biden has surrounded himself with that are on his transition team, that are former Obama era State Department officials that are concerning for Indian Americans. For instance, there's a gentleman on the transition team who works very closely or works for Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. And if you recall, Pramila Jayapal was one of only 5 Indian American members of Congress. She introduced a resolution last year that was very anti-India and anti-Kashmir, and it made no mention of Hindus. How can you, as a Hindu American congressperson, talk about Kashmir and not mention the Kashmiri Pundits who were ethnically cleansed from their ancestral homeland 30 years ago? That resulted in a huge demographic change that you see today. How could you do that? And the people that were involved in that effort are very close with Vice President Biden, are in his transition team, and would likely work in the State Department that would be a Biden State Department. So you will probably see in a Biden administration more scrutiny of India, of Indian policies, more public comments about India's secularism and their democracy. And I think it's going to be a little bit more challenging to continue to elevate the status of the relationship. Again, I don't think that the policies are going to change. I don't think the status of the relationship is going to change. I think that momentum will continue to build regardless of a Democrat or a Republican power. The United States recognizes India's place in the world, India's place in the Indo-Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, and vis-a-vis China, and even more so when you look at Pakistan, which is essentially the Iran of Asia. I mean, they are the largest state sponsor of terrorism in Asia, and they're right next door to India. And India has, a very significant terrorist problem and terrorism problem from its next door neighbor. And the United States is very much aware of this, and so I would like to see, and I think Indian Americans would like to see, greater anti-terror cooperation between the Indian armed forces and the U.S. armed forces. I think both the Indian American community, the American people in general, and probably the Indian people would like to see greater training of armed forces, making sure that the police and the military they're working ethically. They're applying international norms and standards, following international law, and so that would help. Some of the image problem that the Indian government or the Indian Army has when it comes to being a force, being a forceful institution. But when you look at the police and the anti-terrorism forces in Jammu and Kashmir, I mean, you can say that they're probably the most elite forces that are combating terrorism that India has, and that they hold themselves to a much higher standard. And they have been, I was speaking with an Indian journalist last year about Indian police and Delhi police and the police in Jammu and Kashmir, and she was telling me, she goes, the police force in Jammu and Kashmir, they've been sanitized. They've cleaned house. A lot of the bad actors have been cleaned out, and so you have a very professional, very disciplined law enforcement and anti-terrorism force in Jammu and Kashmir. And I think Indian Americans want to see the U.S. Support that even greater and deepen that, because these are people and terrorists who have targeted India in the past, that are going to continue to target India, but they've also targeted the United States in the past. There's a reason why the Wall Street Journal editor Daniel Pearl was kidnapped and killed because he was an American. There's a reason why in the Mumbai terrorist attacks they hit American hotels because they wanted to send a message to the West, not just to India, right? And so this is very much on the radar for American policymakers and American elected officials.
Thanks, Taniel. I mean, you just mentioned about Jammu and Kashmir. I would like to mention that, the image which is being portrayed in US is totally different from what exists like on the ground. If you go to Kashmir and talk to common people, you'll find that, what common people, like what they say, that, if we say or do anything against India, the Indian agencies will, at the maximum, they'll take us, they will interrogate us, and they will set us free. But if you say anything against Pakistan or anything against ISI, they will simply shoot us dead. Journalist Shujat Bukhari was shot dead. Most recently, another lawyer and an activist, Babar Qadri, was shot dead. So, this is the real situation. But I just want to know, why there's this whole the county governments and the local municipal governments passing resolutions against CAA, NRC, or on the Article 370. Why there's this big image problem? Do you feel that is there any, I would say, lack of communication or effective outreach problem from our diplomats or anything else like influence operations by the Islamist organizations? How do you look at it?
There's a lot to unravel there. You peeled away some of the layers of the onion, and I'm going to try to explain for your listeners what the view is from Washington and from America on some of these issues that you talked about. First and foremost, Kashmir has been a core issue for the Hindu American Foundation. That's an organization that was founded by second generation Indian Americans, Hindu Americans, who were born in the United States, who are American, who think American, who went to American universities. And there are a lot of Kashmiri pundits here in the United States. And when HAF was founded in 2003, a little over 17 years ago now, this organization made a decision in the beginning to make Jammu and Kashmir front and center, a core issue, and fighting for the restoration of rights for all the citizens. Women, minorities, even Muslims were disadvantaged under the previous system. Article 370 and 35A were discriminatory articles of the Constitution. And so what we've been trying to do with HAF, working with the Hindu American community, is educate policymakers about the history of Kashmir. Americans have a very short time frame. We have a very short memory. So it's important to us that we share the history of what happened, why the Kashmir Valley looks like it does today demographically. And after August 5th of last year, I can tell you, we at the Hindu American Foundation had conversations with dozens of members of Congress after that decision was made legally by the Indian Parliament, and there was, even though there was something like 30 members of Congress who made statements that was critical of India, I can tell you that there was probably twice as many, if not more, members of Congress who were going to say something critical had it not been for HAF and other Hindu Americans and Hindu American organizations who were advocating and saying, no, before you say something on Jammu and Kashmir, you need to understand the history. You need to know what has happened to the Hindu population, and you need to know that terrorism is the #1 killer in Jammu and Kashmir. More people have died because of terrorism than for any other reason in Jammu and Kashmir in the last 10 years. Terrorism is the #1 killer. That is the problem. And the Pakistani state that supports and sponsors that terrorism is the problem. Now, the second part of what you were asking here is, how come no one says anything negative about Pakistan and everyone's just saying something negative about India, right? India does have a PR problem. That's something that I don't hesitate to tell my friends at the Indian government whenever I have a chance to talk to them. And they need to do a better job on that. But the real problem is communication, is getting that message across. Because what India did is they removed discriminatory articles and they granted statehood and union territory status to the people of Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir who had wanted that. And who will now be uplifted by that. We have a saying in politics, a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think that's what you see in Jammu and Kashmir is an effort to uplift the entire community by bringing in new development, by weeding out the corrupt politicians and families that have been ruling Jammu and Kashmir for years. And so what we did at the Hindu American Foundation is try to educate members on the history of Jammu and Kashmir. We were the first organization to hold a Capitol Hill briefing in the United States Senate within 30 days of August 5th last year, where we briefed members of Congress. We had a video produced, a 3-part history of Kashmir video. If you go to www.hinduamerican.org and you type in Kashmir, you will see our history of Kashmir video. We showed that on Capitol Hill. We shared it with members of Congress. We're constantly engaging and sending emails to members of Congress and their staff on this issue and trying to educate them and make sure that they have all the right information. Now, the second thing that you talked about in your question, you had a lot of layers in your question, so I'm going to try to go through them all. And please interrupt me if I go off too far off topic. But
no, you're absolutely great. Yeah.
what you're seeing now in this last year is an organized campaign from the Council of American Islamic Relations, CARE, and similar groups to damage India, to damage India's reputation. And they're using the Citizenship Amendment Act, the CAA, as the weapon, as the tool. Now, what is the CAA to Indians and what is it to Americans? I think there's a dichotomy there. I think there's a disconnect because to Indian Americans and to Indians in India, the CAA is a righting of historical wrongs, right? It's a correction for the colonial construct that was forced on the Indian state at the end of the 1940s and right after partition. It is an effort to make India a safe haven for religious refugees and persecuted religious minorities, for any persecuted religious minority in South Asia who can only look to India as a refuge and as a place to find freedom, to find democracy, to find a free market economy, and a country that will enable them, that will give them the opportunity to better themselves and their families. You don't get that in Pakistan. People aren't fleeing to Pakistan for refuge; they're fleeing from Pakistan. They're not fleeing into Afghanistan; they're fleeing from Afghanistan. They're not going into Bangladesh; they're fleeing from Bangladesh. And so the image problem here is you didn't call it the right thing. The Citizenship Amendment Act. It sounds like you're questioning the citizenship. It should have been the amnesty bill. It should have been labeled. Anyways, the PR should have been, this is an amnesty bill. Here in the United States, we have illegal immigrants that cross the border on the southern border of Mexico that are coming from Central America. And there are organizations here that are fighting for amnesty to give citizenship, or at least a pathway to citizenship for those illegal immigrants. And I feel like what the Indian government and their what they could have done better is marketing and labeling what the Citizenship Amendment Act actually does. In Congress here in the United States, a bill has a number and a name, but it also gets a title. It gets this really flashy, very sexy title. For instance, the hate crimes is the No Hate Act, right? Well, how can you stand against the No Hate Act? If you stand against the No Hate Act, then you must be a hateful person, right? So if you would have called the CAA a citizenship and amnesty bill or a refugee amnesty bill, and you say, oh, well, I'm against the refugee amnesty bill, then you're saying, okay, so you're anti-immigration, you're anti-citizenship, you're granting refuge to religious minorities. And so just the naming and the labeling of that bill opened India up for criticism, and CARE and these other Islamist groups are going to use that and try to damage India's reputation, try to bring India down. There is a concerted effort here in the United States to have India listed by the State Department as a country of particular concern, or a CPC designation. And if you're designated by the U.S. State Department as a CPC, you are open to sanctions and you're vulnerable to sanctions. And so this effort here in the United States to give India the CPC label, which, who has CPC label? Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, China. Does India belong on this list? Does the largest democracy in the world, are they equatable? Are they equal to the human rights violation that's happening in China? China's committing genocide right now. Right now, as we're speaking, a genocide is happening in China, and no one's saying a thing. No one's talking about it. Pakistan's not talking about it. The Islamic countries aren't talking about it. The United Nations isn't talking about it. If they're talking about it, they're not doing anything about it. And so how could you put India on a list like that? But when you have the CAA and the negative reputation, you have the Delhi riots, which is another talking point. all these things are being used to degrade and demean India, to make it sanctionable, and to make it equivalent to the Saudi Arabias and the North Koreas of the world. But there are very sound politicians, people in Washington who have worked on this issue for many, many years, and they know that India is not Saudi Arabia. They know India is not China, is not North Korea, is definitely not Pakistan. And so there are people in the United States Senate, so particularly the India caucus. I mean, there's an India caucus in the Senate that is close to 40 members. So nearly 40% of the U.S. Senate is on this India caucus. So there will be people who will defend India and who will stand up for India and make sure that people realize that India is a democracy. No democracy is perfect, but it's a democracy nonetheless. And when you look at what you have in Pakistan, you don't want, that's not the model. You don't want to take Pakistan and make Kashmir, Jammu Kashmir, like Pakistan. It's the opposite. You don't want that theocracy. And so that's what HAF, that's what Indian Americans and Hindu Americans and all good people, of people of goodwill here in the United States are trying to do. The second part of your question has to do with the local effort. These organizations, these anti-India, anti-Hindu organizations, they realize that Congress is very pro-India. They realize the United States government is very pro-India. So they prey on local politicians and city councils who, quite frankly, foreign policy is way out of their league and not in their jurisdiction. I mean, unless the mayor of, let's say Philadelphia is involved in a trade deal with Gujarat and is doing some sort of trade deal, there's no reason for a local city council to be involved in a foreign policy issue. But what these organizations are doing is they're preying on the ignorance of these of these elected officials because they're local, right? They're not federal officials that deal with foreign policy. They're local people who deal with traffic lights and potholes and recycling and garbage pickup. Those are the issues they deal with is traffic and potholes and garbage pickup. They don't deal with Citizenship Amendment Act in India, but they don't know better. And so they're being presented this case that India is persecuting minorities, that we hear that there's a South Asian community in Seattle, for instance, and that we're a welcoming city. We welcome immigrants. And if you look at those languages, I mean, it hits all the points. It ties the BJP to fascism. It talks about Trump and Modi. It talks about, what India did legally in Jammu and Kashmir, and it turns it into a partisan issue, right? And so you have Democratic Party-led elected officials signing on to this and saying, well, I must reject the CAA because I reject Donald Trump. And they're sort of tying it, these Islamist groups are kind of tying in the CAA and the BJP and Prime Minister Modi to Trump. So they're trying to not only prey on the ignorance of elected officials, but they're preying on the partisanship that some of these elected officials would have against the president or the president's party. And they're really being used. And again, these are communities that have significant Muslim populations, very little Hindu populations. And it's happened in cities like Hamtramck, Michigan, which I'm sure maybe nobody on this call has ever heard of Hamtramck. It's a suburb outside of Detroit, but it's a very large Muslim population. Seattle is a little bit bigger, but it's a very progressive city. You have a city councilwoman, Koushakjian Savant, who is a self-declared socialist. I don't think she's too far from being communist, but she's a self-declared socialist, Bernie Sanders supporter, who introduced that resolution, and it was all about politics. It was all about Democrats and Republicans and trying to use American partisan politics to damage India. And I think that is the real concern, because you don't see that from the right. You're seeing that on the left. And that is fueling the shift in Indian Americans from a solidly, traditionally stable Democratic voting electorate. They're not monolithic. Indian Americans are not a monolithic voting bloc. But, even Congressman Ro Khanna said, 80 to 90% of Indian Americans vote Democrat. That's not going to be the case in this election. You're going to have it down to 70, maybe 65% of Indian Americans voting Democrat. And that 15% swing can be significant. Now, I want to mention something here that maybe some of your listeners in India or in the United States may have heard about with Congressman Ro Khanna, who is, again, one of the 5 Indian American members of Congress. He got a lot of flack for a couple of things he did in the last year from the Indian American community. So much so that not only has he drawn an Indian American Republican challenger, but now there's a super PAC that was created to defeat him. It's called the Defeat Row PAC. So there's clearly an anger in the Indian American community and the Hindu American community towards Congressman Ro Khanna, and it's for 2 things that he did. One is he joined the Pakistan caucus. Now, I actually don't think that this was a move that he should be criticized for. In fact, I would say that it was quite a savvy move on his part to join the Pakistani caucus, because wouldn't you want a Hindu American to be involved in the conversations about U.S.-Pakistan relations? Don't you want an Indian American or a Hindu American helping to write letters to the president or the Secretary of State on U.S.-Pakistan relations? I would think so. I'm not Hindu or Indian. I'm Armenian American. If I was an elected a member of Congress, I would be on the Turkey caucus. Absolutely would be. It makes strategic sense. Now, the one thing that Congressman Khanna did do that he is definitely warrants criticism is when he retweeted an anti-Hindu political operative and bigot, quite frankly, a racist named Peter Friedrich, who has no academic credentials, who's on the payroll of the Indian American Muslim Council, and is now personally attacking Hindu American elected officials and candidates and Democrats. I mean, he's a Democrat. Peter Friedrich is, because he works with the Democratic Party of California and the chair of the Progressive Caucus in California. But he's on their payroll. And you have these anti-Hindu people. And then Congressman Ro Khanna retweeted him and talked about Hindu phobia, didn't talk about Hindu phobia, but he retweeted an anti-Hindu bigot. And Hindu Americans and Indian Americans have repeatedly requested him to take down that tweet, to disavow this anti-Hindu bigot named Peter Friedrich. And he hasn't done that. And I think the fact that he put out this retweet and further spread the voice of an anti-Hindu political operative is very, very concerning. And that's why you're starting to see a lot of Hindu Americans not only pull away from their support from Congressman Ro Khanna, but from the Democratic Party as a whole. So you have Congresswoman Jayapal, one of 5 Hindu Americans who introduces an anti-Hindu, anti-India resolution on Kashmir in Congress. You have Congressman Ro Khanna, who retweets an anti-Hindu bigot. You have statements from members of Congress who are critical of India, but who don't say anything about Pakistan and their gross violations of international religious freedom and human rights. And you add all of these into the pot and you stir the pot, and what you end up with is a recipe for potential disaster for the Democrat Party.
Thank you so much, Taniel. No, so I'll come back to the U.S. elections once again. Generally, like like in the mainstream media here, and like I guess in U.S. also, there's a perception that if Trump wins, he's going to be very hard on China, and Quad is going to be militarized. Or there are expectations that Quad will be militarized, and India, in terms of military support or diplomatic support at the global level, will be strengthened. But I guess a few days back, John Bolton made a statement that I mean it won't make a difference if Trump wins or Biden wins. Even Trump is not going to go very hard against China. That's what he said on the China issue. Besides that, we have seen like in the past 4 or 5 years that I mean Trump did not take a very strong action against Pakistan. I'm realizing it full well that all the terrorist sanctuaries were safely placed in Pakistan. I mean the drones could have attacked the terror training camps in POK or in the Waziristan area, but we did not come across much action against Pakistan, besides some minor rhetorical stuff in the beginning. Okay. How do you look at that?
So you hit on a good point. When I joined the HAF a year and a half ago, and I started working this issue on Capitol Hill with my colleagues, and I came to this from a different perspective, from a different advocacy career and background, and it became clear to me that the United States government and our elected officials in particular hold India to a higher standard. We hold India to a higher standard because it is a democracy. Uh, whereas we know Pakistan is not a democracy. We know it's a theocracy. And so there's little expectation for Pakistan to stop being a state sponsor of terror. And so is that fair? No, it's absolutely not fair. Um, does Pakistan warrant more criticism than India? Absolutely. Does it receive it? No. Why? Because of the expectations. We have in the US a higher expectation of democracies than we do of dictators. We seem to accept dictators and theocracies for what they are, but we have a hard time accepting democracies that may do things that are anti-democratic. And that's really at the crux of what you're talking about. Something that HAF and others have tried to overcome. It's like, why are we giving Pakistan a pass? Why do they get a free pass on all the bad things that they're doing? Kidnapping Hindu and Christian girls 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, forcing them to convert to Islam and marrying them off to older men. Remember Boko Haram? Remember in Africa when the little girls were kidnapped and American politicians were like, bring back the girls, save the girls. No one's talking about the little girls who are being kidnapped. About 1,000 a year. 1,000 girls are kidnapped every year in Pakistan in Sindh province, converted to Islam and married off into either sex slavery or into child marriage. And there's no mention in Congress about that. These are the things that you're going to start to see HAF and others talk about. We've been trying to raise this up, but again, it's an expectations game. People have expected Pakistan to behave this way. And we haven't had a U.S. ambassador in Pakistan in about 3 years. So that's also hopefully going to change with the new ambassador there.
Thank you, Taniel. And the last question for today's session. I mean, everyone talks about bipartisan consensus against China, but do Americans feel that now it's a time to hit hard on China, like even if that requires military measures? Hello, Daniel, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, yes.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat
Yeah,
the question?
sure. I'm saying that, well, I mean, everyone talks about the bipartisan consensus against China, but I mean, I'm talking about an average, ordinary American, like, do they feel that it's time to go hard against China, even if that requires exploring military options?
There has been since COVID-19, there has been a significant anti-China sentiment in the United States. I can personally attest to that. I know my friends and myself, we now look at things, and if they're made in China, we're a lot more reluctant to purchase them. if I have to spend an extra 25 cents or an extra dollar on something that's made in America or made in India and not in China, I'm going to spend that extra dollar. And I think you're starting to see more and more Americans blame China for COVID-19, rightfully so, for the spread, for the way that they blocked the WHO and U.S. healthcare workers and doctors into going into China and helping back in November of last year, back in December of last year. Americans remember that, at least the ones that were following it at the time. And so there has been, in my view, a significant portion of the American population that is more anti-China today than they were a year ago pre-COVID. The second thing is what you talked about as far as a presidency, whether it's Biden or Trump, it's going to be anti-China going beyond 2020. Presidencies are typically the way the presidency is. It's actually the shortest part of the Constitution, right? The part that explains the presidency and the executive branch. It's the shortest part, and it was done that way on purpose. Now we can have a constitutional debate on that, but for the purposes of this discussion, the presidency, the way it's built, it's a foundation. Each president adds to that foundation. It's built on. It's layers and layers and layers of policy. And so when the president institutes a policy, the next president typically doesn't undo it. It typically continues. You saw a little bit with the Trump administration, the undoing of certain Obama era policies, and that's kind of a first. The way the American presidency has always been in practice has been foundational. You build on the efforts and the initiatives of your past presidency, and you don't undo those unless it was obviously something very, very big. But Trump has tried to undo some of Obama's policies. Now, if a Biden presidency comes in, when it comes to China, I don't see a Biden presidency undoing what Trump has started with the standing up to China position of the United States government. I think that's going to continue. I think Americans understand now that China has taken advantage of us. They've manipulated their currency. They've stolen the intellectual property of American businesses and corporations. They are a growing economic powerhouse and a military powerhouse in that part of the world. And, I don't believe the U.S. Wants to have a military conflict with China, and I don't believe China wants a military conflict with the United States either. They would probably be, they would most likely be the loser of one and would be most negatively affected by it. But at the same time, they are growing more aggressive in the South China Sea. They're growing more aggressive vis-a-vis India and the Himalayas. They're growing more aggressive with the Silk Road and Belt Initiative and with Pakistan. They're growing more belligerent with cyber warfare towards friendly countries like Australia, Japan, and the Quad, and really testing the patience of the U.S. Navy and the U.S. military. And you're going to start to see, I think, an increased Indian Navy and the importance of maritime laws and India's presence in the seas in its periphery. So that's what we're seeing right now. The American electorate or population in general is a lot more anti-China today than it was a year ago. Will that change under Biden? I don't think so. I think that's going to continue, but it's about time. It's about time we had the U.S. government stand up to China and stand up for American businesses who have been robbed of their intellectual property.
Thanks a lot, Taniel. It was really very enlightening to know your thoughts. And, normally we don't get so many insights about what's happening in America. Your experience was immensely beneficial to us in today's session. So with this, we come to the end of our today's session. I would like to thank all the participants, and I would just like to thank Ambassador Pandey. He's here with us. So he's a very veteran Indian diplomat. He has served as ambassador to Azerbaijan and a couple of other Central Asian countries, and he has been a distinguished guest in our previous webinars also. So I would like to thank him for joining us today. Besides that, I would like to thank all the participants, and hopefully we'll meet very soon again for our future next webinar. Okay? Thank you so much, Taniel, for joining us today.
Thank you, Abhinav. I really enjoyed our conversation. Looking forward to future discussions.
Sure. Thank you.